Hey everyone, Michael from Xano here. In this tutorial, I'm going to go over the Twitter OAuth extension. So Twitter OAuth allows the users of your application to authenticate to your application using their Twitter credentials, right? So in the marketplace, if you go to the user authentication section, you'll see Twitter OAuth right here. You can go ahead and click on it. And in order to just add it to your workspace, you'll first do get extension and then install extension right here. You'll see there is some schema that'll merge in your user table. I'll hit install here. And that simply installs the extension. You'll see there are some instructions here now that we actually need to basically configure this extension. If we click configure, you see there's a couple environment variables, an API key and a secret that we need to get from Twitter. So the first thing, if you don't already have a Twitter developer account, is to go create one. Just a quick note there, Twitter has an approval process, and this can take up to a couple of days if there's no follow-up. So just bear that in mind if you don't already have an account. So I'm going to jump to the Twitter developer portal. And when we're at the Twitter developer portal, we actually need to click on this developer portal right here. And now that we're on the dashboard, we can go to projects and apps here. Or actually we can just go ahead and hit add app right here. So that's the first thing that we need to do is add a new app. And you can see we can choose different app environments. There's development, staging, and production on Twitter. We'll start with development because we're just testing, but maybe as you go to a live product, you might want to eventually move that down to production. So I'll hit next. We'll give this app a name. I'll say demo video here, and I'll hit next. And then we'll get our keys and tokens. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this app after because you should never show this information. So the first thing is to copy this API key. And if we jump back to Xano, you can see we can copy the API key and set it as the Twitter consumer key environment variable. So if I just hit configure here, I'll just paste that in there. And then if we go back to Twitter, we can see we also need this API secret. So I'll go ahead and copy this and come back to Xano and simply just paste that in and hit update. And now our extension is configured. There's a few extra steps to do on the Twitter developer portal. We'll need to go to authentication, enable three-legged OAuth, and then add a callback URL and a website URL. Those will both come from your front end, but let's go ahead and jump back to Twitter. So we can go ahead and click app settings right here. And if we just scroll down to authentication settings and hit edit, we can enable three-legged OAuth. Next will be these callback URLs and website URL. So once again, these will come from your front end. The callback URL is kind of like a redirect URL. It's basically where Twitter is going to send your user back to after they've agreed to give your app authorization to their Twitter credentials. And then also the website URL. This is the front end. This is the URL of your front end. So let's go back to Xano. I'm going to use the live demo for this video. So I can just grab this URL. These URLs will only work with the live demo, so don't use this for your actual app here. Go ahead and set that. And then the website URL, I can just grab this demo.xano.com, paste that in, and I'll go ahead and just hit save. So if we come back to Xano here, we can see that all those steps were completed. Just real quick, I just want to go ahead and, before we explore the live demo, look at the two API endpoints that are included here. So as you can see, we have two endpoints. One is access token and one is request token. The first endpoint you're going to hit, or your users are going to hit, is going to be request token. So they might see some kind of button on your front end that might say, hey, sign in with your Twitter account. That button might actually trigger this request token. In this case, they would actually go ahead and be taken to that Twitter hosted web page where they would say, okay, choose my Twitter account. This is okay, allow access. And then they'd be sent back to your application at that callback URL or redirect URL. And then that's when this access token endpoint would need to be triggered. And it basically verifies that all that information is true and exchanges it for a Xano authentication token. There's a lot of logic packed in here, but that's it in a nutshell. Let's jump back to the marketplace and into user authentication. and our Twitter OAuth extension, and we can go ahead and hit Explore Live Demo. And this is what the demo page looks like. We can test this with your Xano account, and we just need to get the base URL from that Twitter API group. So back to Xano here, go to API, and on this Twitter OAuth, we can just copy this API base URL here. And if we come back to the demo, I'll just simply paste that in, hit Update Settings. There'll be a note here just to set that callback URL to this demo site. But as you can see, we're mimicking like a front end here just as an example. So I can just go ahead and hit Continue with Twitter. And this web page will pop up, and it'll basically ask me to authorize the app. So I'll go ahead and select that. Once I do that, I'd be redirected back to that callback URL, and it will say, or maybe you might have a different message, but for our demo, we just have this congratulations. So that's it for Twitter OAuth in a nutshell. Once again, it allows your users to use their Twitter account in order to actually authenticate into your application, so they don't need to come up with an email and password. They can just go ahead and allow your app to use their Twitter to authenticate. So hope that's helpful, and see you guys in the next video.